All right, Steve, welcome back. Welcome back. Good to see you and hear
Thank,
you,
thank you, Jared. Thank you for having me back again.
of course. And I'm always impressed about how much you research and how much time, effort, and energy that you put into these articles and presentations. And for people who are listening, I highly recommend also watching because you did put together a PowerPoint presentation as well. Or if you listen and you're like, oh, that's great, and you want to check things out and get more information, you have all these slides as well as an article that we're going to be referencing. But break down the topic that we're going to go over today, and then I think we just dive straight into it.
Sure. So this is energy system training, which I understand is a topic that can cause anxiety in some people and cause others their eyes to kind of glaze over. And the point of this topic, because it can be quite complicated, is just to assure everyone that we're not going into detail about how energy is made and stored and all that super complicated bioenergetic stuff. We're going to try to condense it down to what you have to do to train and give kind of a basic physiology anatomy review, just so that we can all be on the same page with um, verbiage and all that kind of stuff. Okay.
And I like, yeah, I mean, I like that you're making this like more palatable or like easier for people to digest because this could be a textbook, right? Literally, like you can get into this entire topic and have an entire textbook and then walk away with nothing practical to do.
Right.
And what I like about this article and what you're going to share in this podcast is really what to do. The other thing is, it's not just energy system training, it's energy system training with limited resources. So, do you want to speak a little bit about that as like a balloon topic before we dive into the details?
Yeah, so kind of expanding on what we mean by limited resources, I kind of set up a case study or a scenario to really drive home what that may mean. All right. So in this case study, we're looking at someone who's a former dirtbag. They're 30, 40 something years old. Numbers don't really matter at this point, right? They have a respectable job and they have 3-year-old, 6-month-old, young kids. Their primary proper noun is no longer climber, it is mom or dad. Um, they live in an area of the country with world class climbing, but it's 2 hours away. The closest gym is 1 hour away. And for anyone that has kids, they know that's very close but very far at the same time. And
Steve,
this
just to
person also,
pause for a second. This seems like oddly specific as well. Is this a friend of
this may
yours that
be
you
me.
know?
This may be me. I actually I got a good dose of how much of a dad I am with my Spotify Wrapped today. I am in the 0.05 percentile of people who listen to the song Space Jam because of my son.
That's awesome.
So also, this person doesn't have the money or the space for a home wall or anything like that. Okay, but they think about climbing every single day, and they drive their spouse crazy with it.
Yeah, so
Okay.
if you're listening and this is like hitting the nail on the head, this is for you. And if you're listening, you're like, no, this isn't me yet. Well, stay tuned.
Yet,
Maybe
yeah.
wait 5, 10 years, and your life may be changing a little bit.
Well, and we could copy and paste any characteristic in this. You could be young and not have any kids, but you have a job that stations you in the Arctic or something like that. It could be any scenario. I cannot be the only one who struggles with this. So that's kind of why I wanted to write this article, is A, to simplify energy system training, and B, to give people protocols or ideas for guidelines on how to train it when you have like nothing.
Love it,
Okay.
love it.
So it's mainly how do you stay strong and conditioned when you don't have a lot of free time, you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have a crag nearby or anything like that. All right. So that you can be ready for those days that you do actually get out to a crag or a wall or climbing trips that may be coming up. And so I think that the obligatory skill development and movement economy, or what improves your climbing statement, should be made. That doing these guideline protocols is not going to necessarily make you a better climber. We're talking about uh, the supplemental work that you can do if you do have those resources, but also how you maintain your fitness. Your climbing fitness is different from your skill work when you don't have a wall or a gym or anything to work on. But I do want to point out that 52 to 70% of total climbing variance, uh, or climbing ability, I should say, is related to specific finger strength and training variables. So it is very important to work on fitness and just straight strength. Um, and so strength can only be developed through overloading your body's tissues. Okay. Uh, so when climbers reach a certain grade of difficulty, climbing or just climbing is not enough. So yeah, you got to work on skill development and everything like that, but you get to a certain point where it's just not going to be enough to make you stronger.
And
In
what do you
fact,
feel, yeah, what do you feel grade wise that changes? And I know it's so variable on the individual, and it's probably so variable based on, is it indoor climbing? Is it outdoor? Like what type of climbing? But where do you typically find where this supplemental training really aids in the movement development component, like gets past just climbing on the wall?
yeah, I mean that is a hard question. I know that with me, it was probably around upper 11s to 12s. But I
Mm.
mean, I think that an argument could be made that doing this supplemental training, even when you're a very young climber, helps to build the strength and resiliency in your tendons and everything to prepare you for when you are getting to harder climbing. So, it's hard to say that when you reach this point, you need to start doing supplemental training. I would make the argument that once you decide that climbing is going to be your sport, you should maybe start doing some type of it to help, I guess, with injury risk reduction. Does
Great,
that answer
great.
your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think it's
Yeah.
always it's interesting you brought up. I mean, maybe some people could say, "Oh, I should do it when I plateau." But maybe you do that prior, right? Maybe that helps you kind of like as a gradient to kind of ease into higher grades versus you plateau for a while, you overload with some type of training and now you're not sure what to do. So I don't want to
Right.
sidetrack much from it, but that's always like a question that I have is like when should this training be built in?
Yeah. Well, I think you as a physical therapist knows that everything depends, right? That's all. That's always your answer. It depends.
It depends. It
Depends. It
depends.
depends. You say it very stoically. Well, it depends.
It's
Depends.
really individual based on the person.
Yes.
Very good.
But so again, with everything that we know in strength and conditioning research, uh, campus training, single arm, isometric hang, stuff like that have been proven to be more effective than just climbing and bouldering and improving stuff like early and average phase rate force development. All right. So again, I'm just kind of building an argument or evidence behind doing this type of stuff. It helps you with climbing as far as fitness and strength and everything like that. Not necessarily for skill, of course, but being able to hold on to stuff and move. Okay. Um, and additionally, with certain types of energy systems training, is you are training to exhaustion and momentary muscle failure. And so doing this while you're climbing may result in an injury, or at the very least, you're programming poor motor patterns, and then you're defeating the purpose of skill training, right? So that's why doing this stuff maybe just on a hangboard, because there's tons of energy system drills that people have for system walls and stuff like that, and that is beyond the scope of this article again because we're talking about limited resources. But the argument could be made that if you're training to failure and you're starting to flail around and fall off the wall, you're increasing your chances of injury, but also you're adopting poor motor patterns and not working on coordination. We'll move into the kind of anatomy and physiology review real quick, just again, so we're all on the same page. And we'll start with muscle contractions. I think that everyone in the climbing world is hopefully somewhat familiar with these, but you have concentric, isometric, and eccentric. And an example of concentric would be you actively lifting a load, or your muscle is shortening. So think of pulling up in a pull-up, pulling your body up to the bar. Isometric is a contraction where there's no significant change in muscle length. So you're pushing or pulling against an immovable object, or you're holding a position, such as that's what hangboarding is. All right. And then with eccentric, this is when you're lowering a load and your muscle is lengthening. So that it's the same as when you're lowering down from that pull up.
And by the way, just aside, I'm so happy that you chose closed kinetic chain motion, such as a pull up, to describe muscle contractions, because oftentimes, myself included, I just use like a bicep curl as an example. And that isn't
Yeah.
really related as much to what we do when we climb. So yeah,
Not so
I
much
like
with
this
climbing.
description.
Not unless the climbing hold breaks off, I guess.
Yeah, or maybe like an undercling. You're doing an undercling, or maybe you just
Maybe an
bought
undercling.
yeah, or maybe you just bought a T-shirt and it's the sleeves are too big and you really want to fill them out.
Yeah,
But other than that,
exactly.
I like the pull up concept for
Yeah.
contraction type.
Okay, so we're going to focus now on the isometric contraction because, as we know, climbing is predominantly a isometric sport, and we don't want to just focus on the forearm and hand muscles, even though that's kind of what we're going to talk about with this training. Uh, the entire body is doing isometric contractions when you're climbing. And 38% of lead climbing, 25% of bouldering time is spent statically. All right. But your hand and your forearm muscles are supporting you 43 to 60% of the time, your whole body weight. And that depends on wall angle. They're performing continuous rhythmic isometric contractions with men averaging about 7 seconds per hold and women about 8.5 seconds per hold. And maybe this is why most hangboard repeater protocols have you hanging for 7 seconds on, 3 seconds off, or some variation of that. But that's what I would guess. And then with isometric contractions, we can further break those down into two different kinds. There's yielding isometric contractions, which this is traditional hangboarding, where you're holding a position and you're resisting an eccentric force or gravity trying to open your hand up. And then there is overcoming, this is your no hang boarding where you're using a gripple or a tension board or a tension block or whatever, fill in the blank. So you're sitting or standing and you're exerting a pulling force on an immovable object. This would be more of a concentric contraction, but you're not actually moving. So you're like curling into your no hang board device.
Yeah, and I like that explanation. Like the yielding is isometric, but with a bit of eccentric, and then the
Mm-hmm.
overcoming is isometric, but with a bit of concentric. That's like a very
Right.
clean way to differentiate.
All right, so then we're going to get into muscle fiber types. Okay, and the next several slides have some scary images and words, and people who are watching on YouTube can see them, but I don't think it's that important to knowing and understanding the information. It's just, if you want to look at them, they're here on the YouTube video. So when we're talking about muscle fiber types, um, the most familiar way is categorizing them into slow and fast twitch fibers, right? And slow twitch motor units are small, they develop force and relax slowly, they take a long time to contract, but they tend to be very efficient and fatigue resistant. They have a high capacity for aerobic energy supply, but a limited potential for rate of force development and anaerobic power. So we're going to call these our endurance fibers. Simplify it, endurance fibers. And in contrast with fast twitch, these units are bigger, they develop force, they relax rapidly, they have a shorter contraction time, but they're inefficient and they fatigue much quicker. They have lower aerobic power, but they have rapid force development and high anaerobic power. These are our sprint and strength fibers. And of course, each of these fibers can be classified in greater detail, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion. And we're going to stick with fast and slow twitch. And most muscles have a combination of both of these fiber types, depending on what that muscle is used for and depending on the individual also. So these muscle fibers are not recruited randomly to increase force. They are usually recruited according to their size, with the smaller slow twitch or endurance fibers being recruited first, followed by our larger fast twitch fibers. So simply put, in order to recruit and develop your strength and sprint fibers, you have to activate all of your endurance fibers first. And this can only be achieved through higher intensity loading. And I want to emphasize that statement because it's going to come up later when we talk about training. When you train at higher intensities, you are using both endurance and strength fibers.
I think that's such like a foundational concept that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of because it could seem to be counterintuitive, right? But I do want, can you repeat that one more time for people listening just to like, zero that in their brain because I know you're going to be revisiting that topic with the practical tips.
Yeah, we'll go with the sales and marketing method of saying it at least 3 times.
All right, go for it. Yeah.
When you train at higher intensities, you're using both your endurance and your strength muscle fibers.
All right. When you're training at higher intensities, you're using both your strength and your endurance fibers.
Both, right?
Yeah.
If you're training at lower intensities, you're only activating your endurance fibers.
Nice. I think we said it 3 times.
Okay.
Did we get 3 times?
I think we said it. We'll say it again later.
All right.
All right. So now we're going to get into the energy system part, and it can get complicated, and explanations can get very long. But basically, and this is all I'm going to say about it, what's being referred to are the metabolic pathways that produce and replenish the energy within our muscles that are used for contractions. That's it. That's
Great,
all we're going to say about it.
If you're listening, that's all you need to know. If you're watching, you're like, there's a graph with squiggly lines that says anaerobic glycolysis, and okay, moving on.
Some lines are dotted, some are right. Okay, so the graph that's on here is just putting into a visual of the time frame during an effort with which these pathways are dominant. Okay, so the 3 pathways that we talk about are the anaerobic alactic, which is your creatine, phosphate, and ATP. This is your immediate energy, and it is going to be dominant between 1 and 12 seconds ish. Anaerobic lactic, the second pathway, is the glycolytic. This is your short-term energy. It's going to be 12 seconds to 2 minutes. And then you have your aerobic pathway, which is oxidative, your mitochondrial respiration, and this is your long-term energy. It's 2 minutes and beyond, hours.
All right.
Yeah.
There's going to be a quiz on that for everybody who's listening and watching. And then you have to match boulderer, sport climber, and trad climber, and which pathways they utilize the most.
Exactly. Well, so that goes into the next scary graph that we have. So this is a study that I saw when I was doing my research. This is a study that I saw brought up several times, and it was done in 2007, so it's quite old. But as we know, research on climbing is pretty sparse. I think that it's increasing, but not to the level of football, basketball, soccer, that type of stuff when we're talking about sport research. But what this study does is it shows the estimated contributions of each energy system during indoor rock climbing. All right, and a few details that I want to bring up is that it was done on a small number of climbers. Half were categorized as elite level. The other half were categorized as recreational. Both groups underwent upper extremity power testing on an arm bike, and they were asked to climb an easy route, which was dedicated as a 510A, a moderate route, 511B, and a hard route, 512B. and their VO2 max was monitored during the climbing. And then the authors concluded that the main energy systems that were being used were the aerobic system and the anaerobic alactic system, and that training status, route difficulty, and upper body power did not directly affect the contributions of these energy systems. So it sounds pretty cut and dry, right? There it is. We don't need to worry about the anaerobic lactic system. But there's a couple of points that I wanted to bring up about this. And the first one is that easy, moderate, and hard are relative, especially when comparing elite to recreational climbers. So kind of what we were talking about before is, what is a hard route? At what point are you doing difficult rock climbing? So, I think that is a weakness of the study. The second one is that lactate measurements were taken from the climbers' ears, not their forearms. And based off of what are, so it was taken from their ears, not their forearms. And I don't even want to get into the discussion about whether lactate is correlative or causative of fatigue. And then the third thing that I want to bring up is that their VO2 max was monitored as one of the big things that was indicating what pathways were being used. Now, VO2 max is a measurement of cardiovascular fitness. And we know based on other studies that climbers are rarely, if ever, limited by their cardiovascular fitness when climbing. In fact, other training studies show that improving VO2 max, if you focus on improving your VO2 max in sedentary subjects, you're going to get a max improvement of about 15 to 20%. And in more condition, you're going to get only 10% improvement. So you would have to dedicate a large portion of your training time for a pretty minimal gain that is really not going to get you anywhere with climbing. So to me, this study is showing what your cardiovascular system is doing more during rock climbing than what your forearm muscles need to be doing. And then this brings up the main problem with studies done on energy system training and all of the rock climbing articles and discussions that are surrounded by energy system training is we are taking information done on other sports and applying them to our sport. Okay, but that's the best that we have right now. But we have to be careful in how we interpret it. Is if we are looking at something that is studying an endurance sport like running or even soccer or biking, and then trying to apply those same training strategies to rock climbing, we could be missing the boat on or using up a lot of time doing stuff that's not really helping us. And so, in other words, when we get to the training protocols discussed in this article, they are guidelines, all right? And in addition to using the specific intensity and volume parameters that are in these guidelines, I want to talk about how our forearms are going to feel. So that's the one thing that I am adding to all this information, is that how do your forearms feel when you're performing these exercises? So unfortunately, there is a big subjective element to this, but I think that it helps you for if you are doing drills on the wall, knowing how your forearms are supposed to feel by using a very objective approach in your training is going to hopefully help you reach that same intensity on the wall. So that was a lot.
I think it's a lot, but I think it's easy to digest. I think where people listening, may start having challenges is a lot of the terminology and being like, oh, is that like, how many seconds was that? Or how do I load this? Or even relating this, when you were talking on aerobic, anaerobic lactic, and anaerobic lactic, I was like, well, what about like a 5.9 off width in like Vitawoo? Now we're talking about a whole like different type of climbing, but I don't want to digress. I want to keep the train on the tracks. So let's move this along and break down components and then get into the training.
Sure. So huge, scary picture. And I put that on here more as a joke.
And just for people listening, I don't even know what this picture is. It looks like an upside down table of elements with different colors and lines and circles and pathways and equations. And then it's blurred.
Yeah, it
So
looks like
anyway,
a schematic for a flux capacitor or something. So this is supposed to represent how our energy systems work. But again, we don't need to know all that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter
thank God.
in the context of this article. So the four components, and I think that all climbers have probably heard this, and they all quote it whether they know what it means or not. The four components that we train in energy system training is our anaerobic power, which is our strength and power, anaerobic capacity, which is the strength in strength endurance training, or some people call it power endurance training. So that's the strength part. And then aerobic power is the endurance part of strength endurance training. And then aerobic capacity is the long duration endurance training.
Great. Can you say all that one more time? Just because I'm just imagining I'm like sitting here in my car driving to the crag. I'm like, a lot of those words sound similar. So break it down just one more time. Lock these in the brain.
Okay. So anaerobic power is the focus of you're not using any oxygen for this type of training. Your muscles aren't using any oxygen. This is your strength and power. Pure strength, pure power.
Anaerobic power. Check.
Anaerobic power. Check. Anaerobic capacity is the strength part of strength endurance training. Okay? Anaerobic power, or aerobic, sorry, I'm screwing it up now, sorry. Aerobic power is the endurance part of strength endurance. And aerobic capacity is long duration endurance training. And the next slide actually goes into kind of explaining this a little bit better so that, again, we can all be on the same page. Because you're right. Those words, it's like, well, what the heck is power? What the heck is capacity? Anaerobic, aerobic, what does this all mean? Let's
And I love that I mean, this topic, I know you feel as though you're like, I think this article is rather complicated. And it is, but it also takes something way more complicated and makes it palatable or like really easy, in my opinion, to digest as long as like these terms are like kind of sinking in. But yeah, tell me about now power capacity. Like what's the
Yeah.
difference between these two?
So a quick and dirty way of explaining and understanding power and capacity is imagining a car, its fuel tank and its engine. Okay. Capacity would be the tank with the input pipe for the fuel. Okay. And power would be the engine and the output pipe from the tank to that engine. So increasing capacity would be similar to increasing your car's input pipe and tank, thus increasing the amount of fuel you can take into your car and how much you can hold for use.
I love it.
Increasing
I love that analogy. Yeah.
Increasing power is the equivalent of increasing the size of the pipe from the tank to the engine and the engine itself. So then you would be increasing the amount of fuel that you can deliver to the engine and the amount of power that your engine can generate.
How's that work for electric vehicles? Just all right.
Oh man.
Moving on.
I'm going to have to come up with a different analogy. So this is a very simplistic way of doing it, but in reality, we're using all types of in all types of training, we're using all of our metabolic pathways to different degrees. Okay, you don't at 12 seconds you don't stop using your anaerobic system. Okay, you're using it to different degrees, and depending on where you're at in that effort, is one is more dominant than the other. Okay. So as stated before, we have these guidelines for training intensity that we're going to apply from research on other sports and training each energy system component. However, we also want to go by how our forearm muscles feel so that we can estimate whether we are at the right intensity for our training goals. And we're going to go through each type of training now. This is the part that everybody is probably going to skip ahead to.
Like the application. I bet some people are going to be rewinding, replaying like what we just said, and then another group of people are going to be like, "All right, let's fast forward to 25 minutes in and hear the practical takeaways."
Yeah, you have to put one of those bookmarks on YouTube that shows like this is where we start talking about the training stuff. we're going to go through the guidelines, and then we're going to add a descriptive word that gives you a quick and immediate reference to what type of training or what that type of training should feel like in your forearms.
I love this. Is
And
this did you create like these, like board pumped, like these, are these your terminology that you've kind of associated
uh,
with each?
some of them are, Jared, to be honest, I've read so much stuff that I have lost consciousness of what is mine and what I've absorbed from the outside world.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone knows pumped. We all use
Yeah.
that, okay? Pull hard and try hard is terms that have become a little bit more popular within the climbing. Board, I think I definitely came up with that one because that's
I
how I think
love
most
that
people
one.
say it.
Yeah. Aerobic capacity equals board.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so like I said before, is there are tons of training drills and everything on system walls and spray walls and all that kind of stuff, and those are all great and they can be good in the right situation, but we're talking about what can I do with just a hangboard and in a little bit of time. All
All right,
right,
let's break into it.
let's do it. All right, so the first one is pull. Okay, this is anaerobic power. We're talking about pure strength, your maximum strength. Okay, this is 1 to 12 seconds. You're using your anaerobic alactic pathway, and you're focusing on a very high percentage of your 1 rep max. And you're doing a very slow and hard pull. This is max effort. All right, your sets and your reps are going to be low because this is very hard work. And when you add up all of the time that you're actually pulling, it's going to be between 30 and 90 seconds total time under tension. All right, so that's not very long. And your restorations for this are going to be very, very long because you need to recover appropriately so that your muscles can, fill in those energy stores that you used. And I created these slides specifically, basically, so somebody can do a screenshot
Yeah.
and have hangboard protocol examples and then the parameters for what you should be aiming towards with
And
this type of training.
maybe what I can do is in the show notes have a link on the actual page to just some downloadable
Sure.
components of this if that works. Because then someone will be like, oh, I download that.
Yeah.
And Steve, you should put your contact info on here, or your Instagram or something, so you get some heavy credit for these. I'll
Oh,
put a note for that because I know it took some time to really. I mean, I know it took a ton of time to like put these together, but these are gold. These are like pull a card, and I'm going to focus on this. So I'll put a note. I'll remember to put a link to download, and we can make some edits to the slide too.
sure. Sure. So next is jump. All right, that we're still in anaerobic power, so we're still in that 1 to 12 second range. All right, and this would traditionally be done with a campus board, and it can be done with a hangboard. The only drawback that you get is you kind of lose that dead point or coordination element. Jared, I think that you posted something on Instagram recently about doing like recycles on a spray wall where you're working on that coordination. So again, you're going to be losing some of that skill development with stuff like this, but it's better than nothing when you have again limited resources. Your feet are staying on the ground and your hand is staying on the board. So not exactly like campus boarding where you're doing more of a actual jump. Uh, and this is one of the ones that is probably a little bit more effective if you're using a dynamometer because you can watch on the app uh, to make sure you're hitting the right intensity when you do that quick contraction of your hand.
Yeah, and for most people watching, no dynamometer is basically a load cell that just tells
Right.
you your output.
And we get into that a little bit more further on in the discussion. And on this slide, there's 2 different intensity levels for this jump or power training. And you can separate it into higher intensity would maybe be a little bit more bouldering focused. And then the lower intensity jump could be possibly a little bit more best suited for sport climbing. Again, I don't have anything to support that. It's just
Where the trad climbers fall on here? Yeah.
trad.
I feel like we're a dying breed. It's like
You don't jump in trad, right?
this
There's no
doesn't count.
dynos.
Yeah.
There's no dynos. There's no falling in trad.
Yeah.
All right. So next one is pump. Or oh, my slides were messed up. Powered out. Powered out is anaerobic capacity. So the strength part of strength endurance. And so this is going to be a little bit more 65 to 85% of your one rep max. And remember, this is your anaerobic lactic pathway that's being accessed 12 seconds to 2 minutes. And you're going to do it at this slightly lower percentage one rep max than you were doing for pull and jump. And you're going to feel more of a loss of power due to fatigue, not so much pump. You may feel a little bit of that pump, but it's going to be more just I can't hold on because I just feel too tired. I feel powered out.
I love this feeling, by the way. I don't know if that's odd, but I love feeling like powered out.
Yeah,
The sensation
it's not that my forearm feels like it's going to explode. It's just like
I
it's
just
almost
can't. Yeah.
again, these are hard to describe, but I feel like when people hear the word, they're like, "Oh yeah, I've felt that before." Maybe it's that kind of that little bit of a fatigue relaxation that you feel after a good workout. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I love this. No, I love this term because I can instantly like just connect with the sensation of it versus being like fully pumped. It's like, nope, I powered out. And that's
Right, right.
yeah.
And so with this, it is still a higher percentage of your one rep max, but you're not accessing your maximum strength. But you're still working at a pretty high or moderately high intensity level for a longer period of time. So you'll see as we go along, you go from doing higher intensity, lower duration, and then we start decreasing that intensity, and the duration and volume becomes much more. All right. So pumped. This is the one that everyone knows. I had to put a picture of the Red River Gorge on there. It's what everyone talks about with the red,
So
right?
pumpy.
This is yeah. This is using your anaerobic lactic and aerobic pathways. So again, in the endurance part of strength endurance training. Again, lower percentage of one rep max, 50 to 60% or so, but your volume is going up. And you basically are exposing yourself to pain for longer periods of time, and you're decreasing the rest breaks when you're considering the amount of work that you're doing in order to adapt. All right. Now the feeling that you have is that arm shattering, I can't make a fist, screaming barfies if you've ever done ice climbing type of pump. Like you just feel like your arms are going to explode. That's how you should feel doing this type of training. It is not fun. It does not feel good. All right. But man, at least I feel satisfied after doing this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I bet people listening will like feel connected to these different terms. Like it sounds like you love like just getting pumped. You're like, oh, that's successful. I love powering out. That's my jam. And so I wonder if like people
Yeah.
listening are like, no, they can kind of connect with the terminology that you added to this. And then like what's like this training really used for? Like what do you need this training for while climbing?
Uh, so with this one specifically, it's the kind of ability to recover during brief rest periods when you're red pointing or you're between strenuous pumpy climbs. It improves your more long-term strength endurance. All right. So where the one before powered out, you're improving more of your short-term strength endurance. So this is maybe a little bit more geared towards boulders or people who are doing really hard but short sport climbs. And this is something that we're going to get into later where you're doing a needs analysis. What do I need as a climber? Do I need to do all of this? And we'll get into that, in a little bit here. And then finally, our new favorite one, board.
Love it.
Yeah. So this is your
It's
aerobic.
great. You have a trad climber on there. If people are listening, there's like, all the photos in this PowerPoint are like extreme boulders, sport
People
climbers,
are like
like,
crying while they're climbing.
yeah, just like crushing it. And then in aerobic capacity, there's like an older gentleman trad climbing that
Old
just says,
trad dad.
yeah, it says board.
Yep. Uh, so this is your straight aerobic training, all day endurance, lasting 2 minutes to hours. Okay, and I'm not trying to say that big wall or all day climbing is boring. I love doing it. I've done it before, and those 12-hour days, you feel satisfied afterwards.
Dude, or like technically like big wall climbing is everything but boring because you're doing so much rope management.
It's
You're not even
very
climbing.
mental.
You're
It's very
just
mental.
like
You're not stopping.
mentally
Yeah.
engaged.
So I'm saying more that the training for this can be boring, and that I think that's a problem with it too, is that people will lose motivation if all they're doing is aerobic capacity training because somebody said, you got to be doing this at high volumes, and you need to do this, you need to do this. You're going to lose motivation, and we don't want that as athletes or climbers. Losing motivation is that's a bummer, man. It's a bummer because depending on the source, you're some people say you got to do a ton of that in order to have any kind of effect.
A ton of your aerobic capacity training to have some
A
type of
ton of
effect.
aerobic
Yeah.
capacity
If you
training.
are a
Yeah.
trained individual. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So the basics. So that was a lot of numbers, and so what do we do with it? Okay. So you can get the screenshot of those protocols and everything, and many
Yeah, I'll
of
make
these
those
routines.
downloadable.
Yeah. I don't want to take any credit for any of those routines, all right? They are not my routines. They are from influencers or books or whatever that I've read. And the reason why I present them is because if you look at the total time that it takes to do one of those protocols, it doesn't take very long, okay? They meet the guidelines. There's enough of them to where you can kind of decide, well, this one works for me, and this one works for the type of climbing that I'm doing. But in reality, if you look at the guidelines that are above those protocols, you can create your own hangboarding
Yeah.
protocol, okay? If you're meeting the right guidelines, you figure out what is going to be best for you and help you reach your goals. There's no magic hangboard protocol. One that works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. Okay.
And Steve, the best hangboard protocol? It's the one that you do. That's
Exactly.
like that's the take home, right?
Yeah.
And I love
Yeah.
that it's, these are so accessible, and your title is like with limited resources. Well, time is also a resource. So this allows people with a low amount of time to have basically like a cheat sheet.
Yeah. Yeah. I cannot remember. I haven't added up all the times, but I don't think that there's one on there that lasts more than 20 minutes or so, maybe between 20 and 30 minutes. And a lot of that time, especially if you're doing more the anaerobic power, a lot of that time is resting. So you could be like when I'm doing my max pulls, I'll do one, and then I'll go and I'll start cooking dinner. And then when my timer goes off for my rest, I go back and I do another one. So when you have those longer rests, you can do other stuff while you're resting. And so in order to make sure that you're reaching those intensities, you got to be assessing. Because if you're not assessing, you're guessing. I forget where I heard that, but I like it. And so how do we assess and how do we know what our one repetition max is? Okay. There's two ways to calculate your one rep max. And the first way that I'll talk about, it's where you're basically hanging from a hangboard and you're adding or subtracting weight. And this is kind of based on the Ava Lopez protocol, where you figure out at what weight you're able to hold for 5 to 10 seconds with maybe a couple second margin, and then that would be your max.
And you're adding weight with a weight belt or harness and subtracting with some type of
pulley. Or
mechanism.
subtracting it with some type of pulley, yeah.
Or scale. Technically, you could use like a scale.
You could
right,
do, yeah. There's several ways of doing it. For me, this method can get very tedious And if it takes you several repetitions to kind of figure out what that max weight is, you're accumulating fatigue with each attempt, and your result might not be that accurate. And it also takes time, right? This is not
Yeah.
something that you're going to want to do on a very frequent basis. So you're going to have when you figure it out, you're going to have that number, and you're going to be like, well, I don't want to go through that again. So then that brings up the other way that I like a little bit better, and it's a little bit more efficient and precise. And that's using one of the dynamometers that have become a little bit more popular or affordable in the next years, like the 10 deck or the G Strength or the Climbro or whatever. You can use a crane scale off of Amazon or something like that, but you're going to want a high sampling rate, and it's going to kind of limit you because you're not going to be able to see the numbers that you're hitting because the crane's going to be over your head. The crane scale is going to be over your head. So with the 10 deck, it's got this nice app where you can create your own repeater programs. It's great because you can do a max force testing whenever you do a training session. So you can have an accurate snapshot that day of what your max force is to anchor whatever your training program. So if you're doing, 90% max holds, you do a max force testing, and then the app creates a graph for you and has a little red bar that shows you where that 90% is, and you pull and you try to keep your line in that graph within that bar.
Yeah, it's nice. You kind of have the real time assessment abilities. I think
Mm-hmm.
for people listening who aren't familiar with those devices, a crane scale will probably run you maybe $50. You don't get real time feedback. They're kind of heavy and bulky, but maybe they get the job done. I think Tyndek, what are those now? Like 150, something like that?
I think it depends. They have a couple of variations depending on how much of a load resistance you want to it.
Hmm.
Like they have one that only takes, I think, I could be very wrong in this, but I think it only takes 150 pounds of load, which if you're just using it for hangboarding, that should be fine. Um, and then there's one that takes like 300 pounds of load. And then they have a new
Yeah.
one that has like a rechargeable battery in it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's kind of nice is, yeah, you can use a dynamometer, but if you don't have the money or the resources, well, typically then you have time availability and you can use the protocol where you just add weight or subtract weight. So I
Correct.
think this gives people the option to choose what they want to use to assess.
Correct. And as a side, because this has come up before when I've talked to people about this, is make sure that you're testing on the edge that you are going to be training on. Because if you test on a 25 millimeter edge and then you try to transition onto a 20 millimeter edge, it's not going to be the same intensity.
Yeah, it's good advice.
Yep. And then so programming, how often do you do it? When do you do it? In general, you could train each of these systems 1 to 2 times a week, maybe 3 times if this is like all that you're doing. Like you really have no access to a wall or anything like that. You can maybe do it 3 times a week. And you could use linear 3 or 4 week blocks, usually anaerobic capacity and aerobic power, which is strength endurance. You combine those and you do them in one block. Um, or you could do nonlinear periodization, where, say, on Monday you do strength, on Wednesday you do power, and on Friday you do strength endurance, something like that. And there's really, the research shows that there's really no difference between those two types of programming. One's not necessarily better than the other, but it's better to have that than not do any type of organized training.
Steve, I just want to
That's what's
pause
been shown
for
to be more effective.
yeah, I just want to pause for a moment as we're going through all this in real time. This is pretty amazing, like how like in depth but accessible all this material is. And I don't want to like, overly congratulate you, but this is really, really good. And I have a feeling that climbers listening to this, like, I can't imagine needing any more resources to, than what you have here to have a solid, training program and to self-identify. So I just wanted to, in real time give you a kudos and a shout out for putting this together because it's kind of in my mind building up to being like, oh wow, this is like it's a really good resource.
Well, I appreciate that, Jared, and thank you for letting me present it on your website and as well as the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, okay, so your needs analysis, what we were talking about before. Now this is the part where I don't know, maybe I'm going to be a little bit controversial within the training community. But again, a lot of this I am applying out of logic, out of reading the research and thinking about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. Okay. I think all of us that is what research is how do we interpret it and how are we applying research done with a completely different sport to our sport? Okay. I do not think that all climbers need to train all these components at the same time or at all. Um, this is why you need to perform a needs analysis. Again, time could be your resource that you're lacking. All right, doing all of this energy system training is going to take a long time to do if you're doing all of it. If you're doing all four pathways or components, um, I do think all climbers should be doing some sort of max strength training. But if you're predominantly a boulderer, do you need to do aerobic capacity training? And I would argue that you don't. Now, I've had some climbers who they're like, "Well, I feel really good when you do it." Then I would say, "Do it." I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying I like my training to be efficient as far as time, and I like to get the most economic do the most economic type of training. Okay, because I don't have a whole lot of time. I don't have a whole lot of resources that I can't fit in my basement. Okay. Um, and I really don't think that a whole lot of sport climbers need to do a ton of aerobic capacity training either. Um, there's lots of climbers that perform very high levels of aerobic capacity, and arc training is one of those. And there's some sources that say that you need to be doing 20 to 45 minutes of this very low intensity climbing uh, up to 3 times a day, every day. Most days of the week, 3 times a day. And so that's why I call it board, because that is a ton. And the science informing this type of training is that you're increasing the number of mitochondria in your forearm and muscles and help with aerobic respiration and energy production and clearing out lactate or hydrogen ions. But low intensity steady state work is based again on research done with cardiovascular focused sports like biking or running. And this training stresses the cardiovascular system. So climbing puts little stress on the cardiovascular system, and doing 30 to 45 minutes of work several times a week or even a day is going to kill your skin. You're going to build up fatigue. No matter how low intensity is, you're still building up fatigue. You're possibly increasing your risk of an overuse injury, and you're you're taking away from your time climbing. Yes,
So is
yes,
that
you are.
the
Yes, you're
controversy?
climbing.
Is that is
I guess.
art training hater is a controversy? You'll get some
I,
trolls in the comments.
I, I guess, and like I said, I don't have anything against people doing it. I just,
It's a
it
great way
sounds
to
like
listen
a
to
lot.
podcasts. Yeah.
I was listening to another podcast today where they were saying that, but they were even saying, not to do it that much. You know,
Yeah.
20 minutes could be enough. So that the protocol that I put for aerobic capacity is like 20 minutes. It's basically doing the 1 minute on, 1 minute off that you could do on a wall as well. And the problem that most people get into with arc training is that they end up just traversing around the gym for 20, 30, 45 minutes. And they're
and making
likely
it
not even,
really and making it really annoying to try and like climb over them or whatever. Excuse
what,
me, waiting. No offense, I
you
respect
said
all
that,
people, but when you
yes,
have
yes,
somebody traversing under you and you have a possible, you know, fall two
exactly.
clips up in the gym, you're like, oh, I
Yeah,
don't know about that.
yeah. But when you're doing this, how do you know if you're reaching the right intensity? These people could be not reaching the correct intensity or even going above it. So if you're calling this your warm up and you're doing this 20 or 30-minute traverse and you come off and your forearms are pumped, you've just killed the rest of your session for that day.
Dude, I
Um,
just arc train by like multi-pitch climbing. I'm not even climbing holds. I'm arc training by like managing the rope, and
Yeah.
just like moving my fingers back and forth.
Grabbing the rope and pulling up an
Yeah.
80-meter rope is your arc training.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
Well,
and I
I mean,
think
oh yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of people will be like, oh, well, I'm working on skill and footwork. And I think that most experienced climbers, arguably, they're not going to benefit from skill work at such a low intensity level, right?
I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing with you. But yeah, I mean, I think the key of this is, you know, I think a highlight for those who are like actually watching and listening is what you have on this next slide, which is train smarter and less. And I think that applies not just to arc training. I think is across the board, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And kind of going back to art, I think that, this is probably the cynical side, that the hardened physical therapist, is that I think a lot of people do art training because it's easy and because, it doesn't hurt. It's pretty easy to do.
You feel
Whereas
like you're doing something,
you
right?
feel like you're climbing and I'm working on skill and that type of thing, but it's easy. Where true strength endurance training is hard and it hurts. And considering some of the pain science concepts that we're exposed to in physical therapy, maybe we're not only making physiological changes with this type of training, but maybe we're also exposing ourselves to a certain level of pain or discomfort and allowing ourselves to adapt to it. So I think we can't pigeonhole ourselves with purely physiological changes.
And I
If you're
think
not
that's
exposing yourself to a stimulus, both physically and psychologically, you're not going to be ready for it.
Yeah, and I think that's quite interesting, coming from, medical providers, typically it's like, oh, just do the easy thing, take this resistance band, do a couple of reps, nice and easy endurance. And you're coming from a standpoint that's actually quite different. It's like if you really load and stress these tissues, not only are you building their strength, their capacity, but we're also making changes in the brain to accept some threshold level of stimuli that may, in turn, if you don't overcross that line, maybe could reduce the risk of injury in the future. So it's
Yeah,
a interesting flip side of the coin to a potential opposite perspective someone may have.
yeah. So let's, for the fourth or fifth time, we'll say this. My earlier
It
statement:
depends.
when you train at when you train at higher intensities, you're using both endurance and strength muscle fibers, and we're going to expand on this. So there are no clean delineations between training zones, and by doing strength or strength endurance focus work, you are still training aerobic capacity to some degree and increasing mitochondrial density. Okay. Conversely, if you're only working aerobic capacity, you will not be doing intense enough work to develop the other systems. Okay.
So some people listening may see where you're headed with this, with some
Sure.
type of intensity level that they should train at. Kill
Yeah.
two birds with one stone versus trying to kill each bird individually.
Yeah. So we're talking about, maybe minimum effective dose, economy of training, efficiency, super limited resources as far as time and that type of thing. Um, for people that aren't convinced, let's put this thought experiment out there. Is if you're doing a contraction, blood flow of your muscles is blocked anywhere between 45 to 75% of your maximum voluntary contraction. Okay, it's at this point that we start to accumulate fatigue, and we're feeling pumped and powered out, and we feel our grip force and our endurance declining. So studies have shown that even small changes in maximum strength can have a substantial effect on muscle endurance expressed as time to exhaustion. Okay, so if max strength is increased, less muscle fibers would need to be recruited to perform work below that max, resulting in greater number of fatigue resistance. So you're actually then using your endurance fibers to do a higher level of work. You're delaying the involvement of your type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers. You're delaying, you've delayed or lessened the occlusion of blood flow, and you're delaying the onset of fatigue and force loss. So basically, you're climbing harder for longer with less pump because you're not even accessing the pathway that's producing the hydrogen ions or lactate. So maybe rather than always worrying about clearing lactate and hydrogen ions, we can think of this as increasing our lactate threshold or not producing as much of it with moderate to high intensity work.
Yeah, but I love the connections. It makes sense. What would you say, is there any devil's advocate view of this? Or is this basically, no, like increase the intensity because you're going to get strength and endurance, and you have increases in strength and you have all these wonderful things that you just mentioned. Is there any flip side? Like, is the only flip side that there's the potential for, injury when you do, increase intensity? Is there any other kind of negative to that? Because it seems like it's
Uh,
more efficient. You have all these, great gains. Is there any negative other than potentially towing the
I
line of risk?
Well, I think that if you're just doing max strength stuff on a hangboard, it's pretty safe because you've taken all of the balance coordination skill work out of it. So you're just pulling. So I think that's pretty safe. And again, I'm not saying that aerobic capacity training is useless. And in fact, maybe you hit a plateau. Maybe you're just doing strength and strength endurance training, and you hit this plateau and you're like, well, what am I having problems with? Am I having problems with recovering? Am I having problems with I get pumped really quickly and I can't get rid of it? And then you can add some anaerobic or aerobic capacity training into it and see if that makes a difference. I think it's just the amount of aerobic capacity that can become a problem because we see as physical therapists, we see overuse injuries a lot. And I'm sure you can attest to this, is most of the time we have to tell people, don't stop what you're doing, just do way less of it, and you're going to have way better performance, and you're going to get better quicker.
Yeah, that's like probably 75% of an aspect of
Yeah.
the conversations. And another thing that I think is quite nice that you laid out in this presentation is we're always assessing and reassessing. So there are individual differences and seeing for each person what that right recipe is. And then when that recipe gets stale and you're plateauing, okay, what do I then need to do to make it to that next step? Um,
Right.
do you have any other kind of final thoughts or comments, or that you want as like take home messages? Because you covered like a ton of information,
Yeah.
and I would argue that this is one of the most comprehensive and actionable, well, one podcast episodes, but resources, that you put together. Obviously, I have a little bit of a bias, but that you put together for climbers, and there's a lot of references and resources. But those that are in the moment, like listening right now, and are like, all right, I just listened to all this, who just need to summarize it and distill it down into my head. What would be your like key take homes?
I think the key take home, the one or two sentence summary is that it's very possible for climbers with limited resources, or even arguably all climbers, to perform good energy system training off the wall using just a hangboard or no hangboard, and preferably a dynamometer.
Yeah.
And depending on your needs analysis, um, you can kind of mix and match each protocol or intensity level based off of what you feel that you need and what seems to work best for you. And that again, that this is focusing on your climbing fitness. Okay. It's all about separating skill development from your fitness development so that you can get really strong, and you're not, ingraining poor motor patterns and that type of thing by becoming super tired and fatigued on the wall. You're trying to reduce that level of intensity that you become fatigued at, so that when you do get on the wall and work on your skill training or having fun, that you're able to perform, and you can do it without worrying about an injury or pumping out in 30 minutes or an hour or something like that.
Great. Well, Steve, where can people find you or hear from you or ask you questions or contact any information or resources you want me to direct people to?
Yeah, I got an email that is steven.smith.dpt@gmail.com. That's Steven, Stephen. But I also have an Instagram account. It's themac.pt. I'm starting up the Mountain Athlete Clinic near me, where it's starting off as kind of a free physical therapy consultation service for local climbers.
That's
Because
awesome.
climbing community is not huge where I'm at, but I still want to work with the climbers that are here. So I'm developing that, and hopefully that becomes a bigger thing in the future.
Great. Well, those of you who are listening and watching, yeah, definitely check out Steve's information as well. He has some great articles and other podcast episodes, and I'm always blown away with the content you put together. I learned just as much just hanging out, asking questions, and going back and forth. I'm sure that our listeners do as well. So thanks for coming on the show, and yeah, hope to meet up again soon.
Yeah. Thank you, Jared.